What's good, YouTube? Today we're going to be discussing if there's a better side of DPS. Is Melee DPS better or is ranged on top? We'll be looking at all forms of PvE content when it comes to making this decision, from all Mythic Plus Keystone levels and also the raid. And I'll probably just chuck some random gameplay in the background, so just kick back, relax, and let's figure out if Melee is better than ranged or vice versa. So to start off then, in all Mythic Keystones it seems to be a pretty even spread across the board from DPS. We have Fury Warriors, Windwalker Monks, and Havoc Demon Hunters representing the majority of Melee DPS at around 22.9% of all the DPS being played in all timed keys, with also an honourable mention to the Outlaw Rogue that covers about 5.2% of players, which was expected due to how strong this spec really is. When it comes to ranged, we're seeing the biggest representation coming from the Hunters, the new Devastation Evokers, and also Demonology Warlocks. Between these three specs, they cover about 19.9% of the DPS player base, but obviously just because a spec is popular doesn't always necessarily mean it's also a great performer. So for that reason, we'll move on to looking at the keys timed at level 15 and above. There is quite a difference here, honestly, and I feel like looking at these statistics is a better representation of whether a spec is actually good or not. At keys 15 and above, Hunters and Demo Warlocks cover the majority of the player base. For ranged, around 18% between just these two specs. But for Melee, this is where we start to see the real differences shining through. We have Havocs, Windwalker Monks, Outlaw Rogues, and also Fury Warriors taking up a considerable chunk of the player base at these higher keystone levels. And between all four of these specs, they are responsible for 33.8% of all DPS players, and for good reason too. In these higher keys, you tend to find the better players also playing the better specs. Prime examples of this are the Havoc Demon Hunters, Windwalker Monks, Outlaw Rogues, Demo Warlocks, and arguably Marksmanship Hunters as well. We can see that there's already a lean towards the melee side of DPS, and there's some solid justification for this as well. These specs deal out some insane damage in both single target and AoE, making them perfect for clearing out dungeons regardless of if it's tyrannical or a fortified week. You'll quite often see one of these melee specs mentioned at the top of your overall damage, as they are pretty much untouchable. A common theme between these specs is that they are very bursty, and these sorts of damage profiles are highly desired in Mythic Plus. You could blow up the pack with some mental bursts and also have your cooldowns up for every pack too. Unfortunately, this isn't so much the case for ranged specs like the Demonology Warlock, where you do have a bit of ramp, and although Marksman is one of the most bursty classes in the game, unfortunately it does suffer from a massive lack of survivability that these melee specs and also the Demo Warlocks boast. All the melee specs that I've mentioned so far have multiple strong defensives that make them pretty much unkillable in all situations. I mean, Windwalker Monks have like 4 strong defensive cooldowns. You've obviously got Rogues, which have always been unkillable with your feints. You've got Cloak of Shadows, Evasion, Cheat Death, the list goes on. Whereas on specs like the Marksman Hunter, you'll be fighting for your life, literally. And believe me, I would know. I do just want to make an honourable mention to the Balanced Druid. This spec seems to have gone under the radar like it always does. Moonkins are doing some of the highest overall damage I've seen, but this does come at the cost of losing their kick, which is pretty underrated, especially if you're pugging. But as a whole, melee specs in general do seem to be outperforming their ranged counterparts in a Mythic Plus environment, whether it's due to the incredible damage they bring, the endless list of utility and CC, those being the Windwalker Monks, your Outlaw Rogues, and your Havoc Demon Hunters, that also all boast very strong defensives like I just mentioned. They really do seem to outshine the range specs in every single way. And finally, moving on to the seasonal affix Thundering, that we thought would be a massive problem for a melee heavy comp, has actually proved to not be the case. It makes for much easier clearing of debuffs, although sometimes you can end up clearing too early if you're stacked on top of each other. But in my honest opinion, I'd rather have that problem than lose a ton of DPS having to do a 40-yard dash as a ranged player just to meet my melee friend to clear my debuff, and at the same time dodging some of the tank mechanics and cleaves that I honestly have no idea about being a ranged player. So I don't know if this is a hot take, but I think Thundering does actually favour a melee heavy comp. So my overall thoughts then for Mythic Plus is that Melee has quite the edge on the ranged DPS in Mythic Plus for these reasons that I've mentioned. Although don't get me wrong, it is definitely nice to have a ranged player in your key and avoid that clutter that you do see in Melee. I personally prefer playing ranged, and even though some ranged specs are pumping out some crazy numbers, they do tend to suffer from less utility like the stun, stops, party buffs that we see from these Melee specs that I actually mentioned, specifically the more meta ones. And so yeah, I'm gonna give the W to the Melee for Mythic Plus. Onto the raiding side of things now then. As we all know, ranged are generally much more desired for raiding. There's an argument for this being due to the sheer amount of Melee players that are filling up all the Melee spots already, but generally you can have much more uptime on the raid bosses as a ranged player and thus doing more DPS. If we look at the DPS rankings on heroic difficulty on all bosses at the 95th percentile, I feel like generally we can get the most accurate reading of what form of DPS is stronger, and as we have also seen in the Race to World First, we have seen those arcane mages head and shoulders above the rest, so I'm sure it's no surprise how comfortably they are sitting at the top. And what makes them even better than what this graph shows is that they are mostly single target blasters, which is ultimately one of the most valuable damage profiles in a raid scenario because obviously we want the main boss dead. That always helps. After the arcane mages though, we actually have quite a few Melee specs filling up the next ranks on this chart. As we can see, 3 of them are actually all the rogue specs. When rogues are good in raid, they tend to be insane. And now that rogues also bring a damage dealt debuff to their bosses or the enemies they're hitting, as their main utility, they are true powerhouses in this type of content, or in content in general, honestly. This coupled with them being literally unkillable and the amazing DPS that they're putting out from all 3 specs that can cover all types of fights as well. You've got Outlaw for light cleave, you've got the Assassination for the single target pumping, and you've got Sub as well for that mass AoE. Rogues truly are one of the best classes in the game at the moment. Alongside the rogues though, we have Unholy and Enhancement who are dishing out some incredible damage. Both are up there with the best for the single target damage, but also dish out some insane cleave, and we all know where Unholy shines, AoE baby. Both of these specs also bring some unique utility that help the raid out through the obvious Wind Fury totem from the enhancement, and also the DKs bringing AMZ or AMZ, depending on where you're from, to survive those huge damage taken phases that will be crucial for mythic progression or even heroic progression, honestly. Marksmanship and Balanced Druid follow closely after these specs. Balanced Druid is always a staple of a good raid comp with their unique damage profile and utility. Nothing really comes close to a Moonkin in a spread AoE fight because Starfall is king. Their stampeding roars and innovates also never go amiss and can save the raid in the right scenario. And although unfortunately marksmanship doesn't bring the same raid utility, in fact it brings none, their sheer amount of damage is an argument in itself to bring at least one of them to raid, especially for those AoE burst scenarios. I'm thinking the Dathia platforms in heroic difficulties and above, and also the intermission phases in the Razageth fight. Marksmanship cleans the floor up in these situations, and this type of damage profile has always been a desired one, especially in progression. So all in all, I'd say it's a pretty even spread between the melee and ranged DPS counterparts. When it comes to the Vault of the Incarnates, they all have their own unique damage profiles, and most classes bring some nice raid utility that you'd struggle to find elsewhere. Sorry hunters. Generally, I'd argue that you'd have a better time as a ranged player in getting a raid invite, just due to the sheer amount of melee players, but from a performance angle they seem to be much more even in comparison to Mythic Plus. So overall, if we're saying that melee and ranged are equal in raid, but melee has the edge over ranged in Mythic Plus, it looks to be an overall W for the melee players. Melee specs are just crazy good right now, especially in dungeon scenarios when compared side by side with ranged DPS. They have it all, they top the DPS meters every single pack it feels like, fire off some amazing single target damage, Havoc Demon Hunters I'm looking at you. They have top tier CC in general, and also are very tanky, which is something I've definitely felt victim to on the Marksmanship Hunter, and so that is why ultimately I've crowned them as the winners of Season 1 of Dragonflight so far. If you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to drop a like below, and also subscribe to your boy, that's me, and also leave a comment down below whether you agree with me, what specs you think should have been mentioned in here, and maybe you think that ranged is better than melee. This is all subject to change. Blizzard did say that they were going to do a lot more frequent balancing and tuning, so we could end up with 3 balanced druids in a key before you know it. But until next time, I'll catch you guys later.